Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today, I want to talk about forests. So why are forests important to us? Well, they are of huge economic value for starters. Just between fuel wood, industrial timber, and pulp for paper, that is a large amount of money, billions of dollars. And there are a lot of trees that are actually medicinal. I mean, think about aspirin comes from willow bark, right? Salicylic acid comes from willow bark. So we use trees for more than just construction and burning and paper. We also see a lot of mining and grazing in national and state forests. Plus, there's a recreation idea, right? We want to go camping in the forest. We want to go hiking in the forest. Forests are an immediate connection to the greater picture of nature around us, and we feel inspired in forests. So that's tourism, also a huge amount of money. Now, ecologically, obviously, they support food webs, which supports the trophic levels throughout the ecosystem. They store a huge amount of water and nutrients. They actually create microclimates, so they influence not only the local climate, but also the regional climate. They are homes for habitat, for wildlife species, right? They are the heart of the ecosystem, and they do purify the air. Now, they do produce oxygen, and we will talk about that later on, but really when we talk about their ecological value, it's less about the oxygen they produce, and I'll tell you why in a bit, and it's more about the habitat and the filtration and then just the support of the food webs. They are the primary producers in the ecosystem. This means that forests, both economically, ecologically, and socially, are really, really important. And there are forests all over the world. There are different kinds of forests. When you look up in the temperate forests, you're going to see your huge boreal forests, your temperate rainforests. Then you move south into your deciduous forests, and then you move further south into the famous rainforests around the equator. Lots of forests, and we have lots of forest in the United States, actually, both deciduous, temperate rainforest, and a little bit of boreal. So, when we talk about forests, what are some things we need to know? First of all, we can divide forests basically into two categories, old growth and second growth. Old growth forests are these big, well-established forests. They have lots of ecological niches. You'll see not only just the trees, but there are falling logs, there are standing dead trees. Those are called snags. Both of those provide really important habitat, and as they decay, they put nutrients back into the soil, and so you'll have deep layers of organic material in your soil, well established, lots of ferns, big trees, right? So when we say old, what do we mean? How old should a forest be to be considered old growth in the United States? An old growth forest needs to be undisturbed since European settlement. That's important. And today, less than 10% of the forests in the United States are old growth. This is amazing. And actually, in some cases, we've cut down the forests multiple times since European settlements. 80% of that old growth forest is actually scheduled to be cut. A lot of it is a managed cutting, though, and we'll talk about that later on. So while there are some real downsides to cutting old growth forests. If you manage it well, you can maintain some of those characteristics. And again, we'll talk about that in a second. Now, here is your first kind of case dealing with forestry, right? And this is the one that you need to know. It is the protection of the spotted owl. And those are these cuties right here. Right? So in 1989, environmentalists sued the U.S. Forest Service over logging rates. And they did this because the spotted owl was going endangered. Now, it turns out that this was a much more complicated issue. Number one, right? Yes, the spotted owls were going extinct, right? They were endangered. The timber industry came back and said, if we stop logging, we will lose 40,000 jobs. That is a huge economic impact, right? Jobs, and then also the product, of course, right? So you have this conflict between saving the owl and taken a hit on the economy. So is there a balance, right? And that's really the question that came out of this case was, can we save the owl and can we have the economic benefit of forestry? And we'll talk about this later on. This is what led to managed forestry, like forest management. Okay. Now, here's the catch about the spotted owls. As we were logging the forests and their habitat was decreasing, there was another pressure that was applied to them that made their plight even worse, and that was the barn owl. When the barn owl started to move into the territories where the spotted owl lived, as it came with people, right, it put a huge pressure and started to compete with the spotted owl. And so by the time we recognized that the spotted owl was having problems, even if we were to stop logging entirely, because the barn owl has already been introduced and moved into the area, the barn owl now places a pressure that we don't on that owl. So this is one of the things that we have to be careful about, are the unintended consequences. As we start changing ecosystems, other things happen. And we'll talk about this more again too when we start in the life unit. Okay, so second growth forests are the other type. This is what happens after you have cut down the forest, right? You get a new forest. And so this is a result of what we call secondary ecological succession, which I will talk about in a little bit. And this is what happens after we clear cut, after you have fires, volcanic activities, like whatever, natural disasters. Now the catch about here is you have trees, they provide habitat, and that's great. But because they're younger, it's not as well established. There are fewer niches, there are fewer dead trees, there are fewer fallen logs, and so there's less decaying vegetation. This is not as complex and stable an ecosystem as the old growth forest. Okay, which of the following is not true about forest ecosystems? Forests provide a number of natural services. Sparse human populations can easily be supported by natural forests. Numerous forest products have been harvested for food, fiber, and medicine. Loss of forest species ultimately results in the loss of forest ecosystem services, and intact forests are highly compatible with human agriculture. Well, it turns out one of the biggest pressures we actually put on forest ecosystems is agriculture, right? As we need more space to grow more food, or if we've exhausted poor soils, we start clearing more forest for agriculture. And so oftentimes intact forests and human agriculture are not compatible at all. So this goes to the idea of managed forests. About a quarter of the world's forests are actually actively managed for wood production. And this is what is going to make forestry sustainable in the future. So one of the things we really want to focus on is sustainable harvest, right? Now, many reforestation projects have in the past involved monoculture forestry, and we know that there's some downsides to monoculture because we've talked about monoculture in terms of agriculture. The same things apply to monoculture and polyculture. The catch about forests is that they are, even if they're not hugely diverse, they still have multiple species of trees, and that's really important. You need to have more than one species of tree. Because one, you always have that danger if you have any sort of pest or pathogen that comes in and kills the trees, you will lose all the trees. If there are multiple species, you will still keep some of the other species. So this is a real downside to the monoculture forestry. And early on in forest management, this was kind of the philosophy: we just need to get more forests really fast. And that's the pro of monoculture: rapid growth, easier harvest. But you're disrupting these ecological processes by not having the varieties. So essentially, early forest management was really more like a tree farm, right? And we do have tree farms. They're used to produce wood, or plantation crops, depending, because things like coffee and chocolate and bananas all grow on trees, right? So you can also do plantation crops with tree farming. It's more efficient, right, if you actually establish the tree area. The con is there are very few ecological niches. Now, here's the pro though. If you have dedicated tree farms that you are constantly harvesting in, you can actually reduce pressure on old growth forests because you're filling the need for the wood or the product, whatever it is, in these tree farms, and that's a big pro. Okay, so whether you're talking about a tree farm or you're talking about managed forests or unmanaged forests, we cut down the trees most of the time. That's what we're doing. And traditional harvesting has been clear cutting. Clear cutting is where you just cut down everything because it is fast, it is efficient, but it really wastes small trees, and you get these large areas that used to be held in place by tree roots. So you get a lot more erosion than you did before. That leaches nutrients, you lose the topsoil, you lose the ability for the forest to reestablish itself, and of course you actually destroy the ecosystem by eliminating wildlife habitat and food sources. So, what are 3 ways that clear cutting ecologically impacts the intact forest from the previous picture? It increases interior habitat, creates edge effects, and restores soil vitality. It increases the likelihood for invasive species invasion, creates edge effects, and disrupts ecological processes. It increases forest interior habitat, increases soil erosion, increases noise pollution, or it increases interior habitat, increases sedimentation of waterways, and reduces soil fertility. Well, lots of these things are true. So, first of all, let me tell you the answer is number 2. It increases the likelihood that you'll get new species coming into the area, and we'll talk about invasive species later, not today. It creates edge effects, right? Because you destroy parts of the forest, and now places that used to be interior are now the edge of the forest. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it disrupts all the ecological processes because you lose the forest. So number 2 is correct. But it also increases soil erosion. You increase noise pollution while you are logging. You increase sedimentation of waterways because we're getting more soil erosion. And because we have that more soil erosion, we've reduced soil fertility. So there are several things in here that actually are correct, right? This whole thing, this is correct, this is correct, this is correct, and this is correct. Okay, but there's only one answer. It was number 2. All right, so we need better harvest methods, right? So the first one is strip cutting, and that's where you just harvest a strip out of the forest, right? And this saves young trees. It prevents erosion. It also causes habitat fragmentation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute as well. Now, the other thing that you do, and this is probably one of the best things to do, right? This is probably the best method of management. You selectively cut, right? It's sometimes called shelterwood cutting, but a small percentage of mature trees are taken in 10 or 20-year rotations. So you are actually always cutting trees, you're always getting a product, but you're only cutting the most mature trees, and so you're leaving baby trees and healthy trees, so you can actually retain many of the characteristics of these mature old growth forests if you are selective cutting, right? So which of the forest harvest techniques would allow greater biodiversity and more stages of succession? Even age management, tree farming, clear cutting, shelterwood cutting, or plantation forestry? Well, if you were paying attention, it's what we just talked about. Shelterwood cutting, which is also selective cutting. Okay, so how do you get into the forest to log? Well, you need a road, right? So roads have actually been built through national forests, lots of forests, but national forests in particular. And the interesting thing about this is that, one, you have the road problem, which we will talk about, whether it's a private or public road. All roads through forests have problems. But in particular, roads in national forests are a problem because the federal government pays for them. And so you have companies that are making billions of dollars off of harvesting and recreation, right? Using these roads. But here's the catch. The harvesters make $4 billion annually or so, right? Recreation and ecological function add up to over $200 billion. So is it better to focus on the recreation component, or is it better to focus on the harvest component? Because a lot of times these two things don't go well together, right? Now, the other thing is that taxes pay for these roads. So not only do logging companies get the product that they are harvesting, they sell that, they get free roads to drive on too, right? So it's a little bit like a hidden subsidy to the timber industry. So that's just another little aside about the economic value situation. Okay, now let's talk about the logging roads. Again, whether they are private, built by the companies, or they are public, built by taxpayer dollars, they cause some real problems. The biggest problem, of course, is habitat fragmentation. And I will talk about that in just a second. Increased runoff. You've removed the root systems. You have this flat place where you do not have infiltration occurring, so you're going to get that erosion. That's going to lead to sedimentation in waterways, pollution from all the vehicles driving on it. So big deal there, right? It is also a pathway for exotic species. And one of those exotic species is us. When we build roads, we will drive on them, right? We will eventually pave them. We will turn them into highways. We will start needing gas stations. We'll start clearing the areas for agriculture. We'll start moving in, and pretty soon along that old logging road, you now have a big highway and a city that goes with it, right? Or at least a big highway and farms and little towns that go with it. Whatever happens, though, we have destroyed the forest to do it. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about habitat fragmentation. So when you have your forest, you have the edge areas, right? And then you have the interior areas. The interior areas are protected from wind and sunlight. So the trees out here are a little bit hardier, and they have adapted to different conditions than the interior trees. You also have lots of space for animals to have all of the territory that they need. Okay. Now, when you build a road down the center, you decrease the interior habitat, you create more edge habitat, and these trees here used to be interior, so they're not actually used to the new light conditions and the new temperature changes and the wind. And so oftentimes you can actually get tree deaths here in the edge effect area. Okay, so you have your original habitat, you start cutting it, you get edge effects. Those trees may die, they may not, but eventually what happens is you get larger and larger gaps and species will begin to disappear. Now, when we talk about forests around the world, we are losing forests on a regular basis. Now, in some places, that's been mitigated because of forest management, but in these big rainforests, for instance, we're still losing on a regular basis, right? We lose lots and lots and lots of forest every year. And so that's one of the things that we need to think about. How can we take pressure off of these forests? Management, tree farms, things like that, those are all good. But we also need to think about the products. So as an example, what would be an alternative to harvesting timber? Clear-cutting forests, reducing tree harvesting subsidies, certifying sustainable lumber, or making paper from a non-tree source. Well, these three are all about the forestry itself. What we need to do is take the pressure off of the needing to cut trees, right? And so that means that you want to use non-tree sources for things. So an example could be maybe we make paper from non-tree sources, right? Maybe instead of using wood chips at playgrounds, we use recycled tires, right? Things like that. So we have to get a little bit creative to kind of say, okay, where can we stop using wood? Where can we use something else that may also be beneficial? And as for the tire example, we'll talk about that when we talk about solid waste. All right, so tropical forests actually occupy less than 10% of the Earth's land surface, but they contain more than 2/3 of all higher plant mass, at least 1/2 of all plant, animal, and microbial species in the world, and they are the second largest producer of oxygen. Although this is actually not something that's going to affect us directly, this last part, because all of the oxygen they produce, they use. But here's the thing, all the oxygen they produce is vital to keep the forests and all of the biodiversity there alive. So it's not like, well, we don't get it, so we don't care. They get it, they use it, it's really important. And all of these rainforests are shrinking. They're shrinking rapidly. We think that just less than 1% of all of the remaining forest is cleared annually. That's a rough estimate. Countries have economic and political reasons to hide how much forest they're actually cutting down. Real losses may range from 5 to 20 million hectares annually. And interestingly enough, Brazil has the highest rate of deforestation, although this is something they're talking about and working on. But you can see it everywhere, right? This is Madagascar. This is a baobab forest, and you can see you have all these beautiful trees, and here are the big baobabs. This is really what these forests look like today. Okay, now the baobabs are sacred trees, and so they are left, but you can see that all of the other trees have been cut down, and you know that this used to be a rainforest because the baobabs have all of their leaves up here and no leaves down here. That's because there used to be trees around them. This is how they competed for light. Okay, now other things will also kill forests. Building dams floods forest areas, and then those trees die. There's lots of mining and oil drilling in places where there are forests. And commercial logging just in general. Lots of developed countries import lots of wood every year. Japan actually imports over 50% of tropical wood imports. And so people who used to rely on the idea that their forests would take care of them and provide them a source of income do not have that anymore. Europe imports over 30% of its wood, and even though these places manage their forests really, really well, they just don't have enough wood. And the US imports about 15%. Part of it is because some of that wood is cheaper. A lot of the imported wood we see is exotic woods that just don't grow here. Okay. Now, agriculture, of course, is a huge pressure. Unsustainable small-scale subsistence farming with the slash and burn forestry, which depletes the soil and destroys huge amounts of forest, is a big, big problem. And a lot of that forest is being cleared not just for subsistence farming, small scale, it's for large cash crops on those plantation farms for things like sugarcane, chocolate, pineapples, cotton, bananas, tea, coffee, right? Cattle ranching is another thing. When the soil stops sustaining farming, the farmers will move on, and then you'll have some grasses that will grow, and so you get cattle grazing, but they quickly overgraze, and you have all the problems that you see in rangelands where you have overgrazing of cattle. And so erosion and overgrazing are sort of the final destruction piece on those forests. Eventually, the ranchers have to move on, and now you just have this sad, depleted, unrecoverable land. Now, here's the other thing, fires. Fires are, on the one hand, really important. On the other hand, we don't like them very much, right? So fire management in forests is a really big deal. Firefighting is a high priority for forest managers, but there are some problems with this. Many of the forests that have fires in them are fire adapted. They actually need fires. And we don't want fires because we don't want our houses to burn down. We don't want our cities to burn down, right? We don't like them. And so instead of letting dead stuff, right, dead brush and things burn out periodically, which puts nutrients back into the soil, it clears out the area, it sometimes helps plants germinate, right? Especially some of those evergreens that you see. You get this accumulation of woody debris in the absence of those fires. And the Forest Service actually estimates that about 40% of all federal forest lands are at risk for really severe fires. And I need to update this because I haven't, but as of a couple of years ago, 2001 ranked third for most fire damage, but 2018 has seen a huge number of really intense fires. The Camp Fire that was recently gotten under control cost billions of dollars and killed many people, right? So this is a big deal, and firefighting on average costs about $2 billion annually for forest fires and grass fires. So the real problem here is, how do we manage fire and undo years of fuel buildup? So how can we have healthy fires without hurting people, without burning down houses? But we need to do this to manage the forests, and this is a real problem. I mean, there isn't a good answer to this. But essentially what we need to have are surface fires, which just burn low on the ground. They burn out all the brush. What we see right now are crown fires. And this is a real problem because fires down here, there's lots of resin, there's lots of protection in all of these plants, and so you just get the good nutrients. When you start burning up here in the tops of the trees, this is the growing area. And so what you're really doing is killing all of the new growth, and this eventually kills the trees. Okay. All right. Which type of forest would probably contain stands of trees that grew following a fire? A tree farm, a second growth forest, an old growth forest, or none of these? It is a second growth forest. So now we have talked about clearing land for agriculture. We've talked about fires. We've talked about just cutting trees in general, all of these things. Forests grow back, right? So we want to talk really quickly about the difference between, well, we want to talk about succession. There is a predictable progression of the types of plants that you get when you start with a certain stage. So primary succession is where you start with exposed rocks, right? The first forests come from this area. When you get new land built up by volcanoes, for instance, islands, you'll see plants come in, volunteers will come in, and they'll start growing, and eventually you'll get these big forested, I mean, think Hawaii, right? You have these big kind of forests there, and they're in the middle of the ocean. It started out rock. This is primary succession. Sorry about that. This is primary succession. So what you get is you have your exposed rocks, then you'll start to get lichens and mosses. Then after these break apart the rocks and you get a little bit of soil buildup, you'll see these small shrubs and herbs that are able to grow in real harsh conditions. They will make way for the next thing, which will be some bigger shrubs and things like that. Then you'll start getting some of your quick growing conifers, right, your evergreens, and then eventually you'll get to your mature community, right? So eventually you get to this mature community where you have these big, slower growth, harder woods. It's called a climax community when you reach that. Now, when you cut that down or you destroy it in some way, you'll go into a secondary succession phase, right? In the secondary succession phase, you already have all the soil built up, so you get weeds. Then you'll start, and they're annuals, then you'll start to get perennial weeds and grasses that'll build up more soil. Then you'll start to see your shrubbery. Then you will get your young pine forest. Again, it's always pines that are going to be this next species. By the way, the species that come in the first stage of succession are always called pioneer species. They're called pioneer species. And then eventually, in the secondary succession, you'll either go to those slow-growing evergreens, or depending on where you are, you might get these slow-growing hardwood deciduous trees. In here, you might actually get some deciduous trees too, depending on where you are. Now, there's a catch to succession. It doesn't always go to the climax community. Think about grasslands. Grasslands get stuck here because there's not enough rain to support trees. So in different biomes, you'll stop in different phases of succession, but if succession is allowed to go with all the resources it needs, you will get into these big, slow-growing trees. And that's a little bit about ecological succession. So our new goal, with all of this stuff in mind, is ecosystem management. Now, ultimately, this started in the 1990s, right? And part of that was that spotted owl case that I was talking about, but part of it was the idea that if we are going to have forests in the future, right, and we do want to have timber production, but we also want to have these robust ecosystems, we're going to have to manage them. Now, ideally, what you're doing is you're looking at a sustainable ecological approach that matches our social and economic goals. So you have to find that balance between economic needs, social needs, and environmental needs. And that's actually a really difficult thing to do. And mostly you'll see this in the developed world. Ecosystem management, forestry management is a developed world thing. However, we have started trying to work with developing nations to come up with some strategies so that they can also really focus on conservation and ecological development at the same time. So what is that called when you have countries act as custodians for protected ecosystems in return for foreign aid or debt relief? This is actually called a debt for nature swap, and we have lots of debt for nature swaps going on around the world right now. And the United States is in a position where we can actually alleviate debt, well, forgive debt, and give financial aid for conservation programs. And the tropics are the areas where you see the greatest destruction and the greatest species lost in the world. So we have these debt for nature swaps there. But then the other thing that you see is a rise in ecotourism. And ecotourism is really beneficial in lots of places. And remember when I showed you the idea of $4 billion for timber versus $200 billion for recreation? It can be much more lucrative in the long term than the extractive industries like oil, mining, and timber, right? This is something that's sustainable. You can come back season after season, and so it's worth preserving the ecosystem for this. And wildlife watching and outdoor recreation are huge. They are huge, and so they can really be a welcome source of income, and they can be job generators for underdeveloped countries. And so instead of going on safari and harvesting, you can go on safari and shoot photos, right? And that's kind of a nice thing. And it doesn't mean that there isn't room for other activities like hunting, big game hunting, things like that. Those also have to be managed, and this is something that we'll talk about later on. we start talking about wildlife management, right? But ultimately, ecotourism is a huge generator of money. It encourages preservation of habitat and species, brings a lot of money, adds a lot of job, and ultimately what you're going to do there is reduce poverty, and you're going to give people a sense of pride and connection to their homeland. And so when you are invested in the land, you will protect it. Now, there are some cons to it. It disrupts habitat like everything else, because if people are going to go and they are going to have this experience, they still want to have the amenities that you would find at any type of resort. So there's a lot of construction of things, amenities, resorts, stuff like that. There's going to be driving, lots of driving, and so you're going to get roads, habitat fragmentation, and then you'll get compaction of the land from the vehicles themselves. Trash. We take trash everywhere. Mount Everest is covered in trash. Everywhere we go, we're going to use resources, we're going to use water, and we're going to emit pollutants and greenhouse gases. So there is a trade-off there. Everything we do has an impact. The question is, overall, how does it balance out? And in terms of extractive industries versus ecotourism, ecotourism can have, doesn't always have to, but can have a smaller impact. Now, if you don't do it in a sustainable way, if you do it like you do everything else, just like, hey, let's go whole hog, then it's going to have just as big an impact as any extractive industry. So the whole point is sustainability. And the extractive industries we'll talk about when we talk about energy are also trying to be more sustainable. And so it just depends, right? That footprint is going to depend. Okay, that is it. It was a lot of information. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Make sure to ask your questions in class.